Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Edwina Dunn, is the co-founder of dunnhumby, the data analytics company behind Tesco's Clubcard and numerous loyalty programs worldwide. She has served on the board of HMRC as a non-executive director, as a commissioner on the Geospatial Commission, and as chair of StarCount and the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. Edwina also leads the Female Lead, an initiative to celebrate women's achievements and address workplace challenges. Edwina, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm happy to be here.
Edwina, can we start by talking about the board's value add in your founder journey? And I'd love to hear you talk us through the dunnhumby journey. And I'm particularly interested in what you saw as the pivotal moments and decisions that a board member listening might learn from.
Oh gosh, that's a big question to start with. I think the first observation I have was when I started, of course, we were just two people and we started, well, we now call it the kitchen table. So there were just the two of us either agreeing or disagreeing with each other. And of course, we were husband and wife as well, which made the dynamic a little more piquant, shall we say. But we were polar opposites. So on the whole, we got on very well with our individual skills and interests. By the time we started work with Tesco, I think we were 35 people. So we'd been going for just under 5 years, and along they came, and we'd had this big vision, this big idea. And then suddenly we were given this really big job, this really hugely ambitious task, which was suddenly to take the biggest data that had ever been harvested in the UK and to analyze it. And there was no technology that was actually big enough to do that in the day. Even our technology was some of the data, some of the time. So it was a big challenge. We were working with the senior directors of Tesco. So here we were, a still very small organization, dealing with a very mature, very grown-up organization. Being a CEO in that environment was interesting. When eventually they took a stake in our business and formally became a shareholder, the dynamic changed again. And that's when there were definitely some comments about there's a big difference between being an entrepreneur and being a CEO, Edwina. Oh, really? Yes. And throughout our growth and throughout that time period, I was often reminded what a professional CEO would do. Actually, we were an entrepreneur and on an entrepreneurial journey the whole way through it. I didn't worry too much about that.
Maybe we could start by just going back to that moment when you first got the call into Tesco, because I think that's a moment a number of organizations, various stages, lucky enough to have, where they have that meeting with a potentially transformational partner, customer, and yet most don't manage to capitalize on it in the way that you managed to do that. As you look back on it now, what do you think you got right there?
Yes, so the moment that became game-changing for us was we were at a conference and we were talking about this tool set, this sort of technology platform that we'd built that was designed to hold big data, which was very much the AI of its day. Big data versus what was usually held, which was just small amounts of research data or summary data. And somebody from Tesco was at that conference and they heard us. And from that said, oh, we've got a challenge that you might be able to help us with. And it was that moment where this fairly young, not junior, but fairly young chap from Tesco basically said, we've got a challenge. I've just heard you say you handle big data. I'm going to put the two together. And that became the moment at which we were then given the chance to actually analyze something that Tesco couldn't analyze itself, which we did. We took 3 months. We had some test data that they'd been running with to see if they could collect data on what people were buying and find out if their idea of an incentive, of saying thank you to customers, would actually encourage people to visit more or spend more. The challenge they had, they couldn't work out whether it was working or not. And so that's what they gave us. And so 3 months later, we had all the information. We'd analysed it. We had all the facts. There was another really important point. So this young guy who's called Grant Harrison, he was a New Zealander. And we were feeding back what we'd found from the data. And he kept stopping us and asking us questions. And in the end, he said, look, this isn't going to work because I'm asking you all these questions. They're going to ask even more, and I'm not going to be able to answer them. So you guys have to come into the boardroom and present it. So he did 2 very important things that changed our future, and all credit to him really, because he got us into the boardroom. And that was when we had our really special moment where we presented, and Ian McLaurin, now Lord McLaurin, I think he was Sir McLaurin back then, heard what we had to say. And that's when he paused and then said those really apocryphal words, which was, I don't believe it. After 3 months, more about my customers than I know after 30 years of Tesco. And that humility was incredible. How many CEOs would today say something like that? Not many. That humility, that understanding that this is gold dust, he saw. And really from that point, it was, this is so exciting. How fast can we do this right across the country? And that was his next question.
And what was going through your head at that moment? You must have realized that you had a really special opportunity then. Did you have any worries about, were they just going to copy what we were doing? How is this going to work? Or it was just pure adrenaline at that moment?
It was mainly, oh shit, we're going to have to do it. It was really difficult. This data was huge. And so it had never been done before. So it was untried and untested. The context of this is when they spoke to their IT team and then to their big suppliers, their big technology suppliers in the market, when they asked them, can you do this and how much would it cost? The quote that came back was 3 years and £50 million. Now you could do it on a mobile easily, but you couldn't then. And when we came back and we said, what did we say? We said £250,000 in 10 weeks to set it up.
Amazing. Now, organizations that are lucky enough to get that sort of breakthrough with a key strategic partner like that then often face that challenge of, do we bet the farm on going all in with them and run the risk that by being so concentrated and exposed to them, they end up killing us because at some point maybe they pull the rug from underneath us. What was your thinking as time went on around that? How did you get comfortable taking that risk?
Yeah, we were criticised for that when we were looking at investors, when we were looking to raise some capital for ourselves after years of working with very little pay. We were really hard up at the beginning because we'd sunk everything into it. A lot of people said to us, this is really risky. You put all your eggs in one basket. You're making the business very vulnerable. But the judgment we made, and I am so glad we made that judgment, was if we could show Tesco that we were fighting for their success as much as they were, if they could see we would be loyal to them, they would share everything with us. And to this day, the retailers that we've worked with through dunnhumby around the world, they shared their most precious information with us that they've never shared with any other supplier, which is the margin on their products. And I think still today, there are not many retailers who would ever share that information with anyone. Once you understand things like profit margin by products, you can do a much, much better job for the retailer.
Why do you think they shared that with you and not others?
Because they trusted us and they knew we were always defined as strategic. And in the end, one of the reasons they invested in us is because they said we had become mission critical So we were no longer like an extra or a nice to have. We were absolutely mission critical. We had an original investor. We had a South African media company, Prime Media, who bought into dunnhumby before Tesco, and they bought a 30% stake. This was in the .com era. At that time, we actually took some money out of the business, the first time we had, which paid for our mortgage and our children back at that time. So it was a very important phase for us. And of course, then we had some board members who were from Prime Media. But then, as you might have heard during the .com era, there were a lot of flotations that were at a very exaggerated valuation, nothing to do with profit. And at that time, Prime Media wanted us to exchange our shares into these group shares where they were going to float 3 businesses, including ours. And I looked at the business model and how the projections were set out. And I just thought, just don't believe we can do that. And I don't understand what all these people are and how we all fit together. And when we effectively didn't buy into that flotation, which was $1 billion float at that time, apparently, of course, that ended that relationship. It just ended. And so it was at that point we said to Tesco, we're going to have to raise some money, some finance to buy out this media company. And I said, would you be a reference for us? And they thought about it and they said, we got a better idea. We will be the investor. That was the point at which not only did they buy out the media company, but they actually gave us the rights to Clubcard data. So suddenly dunnhumby owned Clubcard in terms of income generation. And that's when we were able to offer the same data anonymized to all of Tesco's suppliers in the UK.
Wow.
And that changed our fortune.
Do you think they didn't realize the value of it, or why did they give that to you?
Why did they give that to us? Because they had at that time taken a 53% stake in us. So they owned us.
Okay, so it was the ownership that they had that unlocked the value creation of being able to monetize their data further.
So the fact that we owned their data and they owned us made them very comfortable. And our view was that half of a bigger pie was worth much more than 100% of a much smaller pie.
For sure. Fascinating. Going back to the Prime Media investor directors as they were, did they add any value for you as investor directors?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think you learn from any successful business partnership. They were smart people. They had cinemas and radio stations right across South Africa. And they had this vision. And at the time, .com era, nobody really knew how that was going to play out. It was such a new adventure. So it was very confusing because we'd always been about profit and cash generation. And then suddenly in .com, it was like profit doesn't matter. I was like, whoa, it was weird. So
can you give me a specific example of where you thought they added value as investor directors?
I can think of one, but I can't tell you it because it's a naughty South African swearing quite badly. Let me think of another one.
Oh, that sounds great. You can't deny us that now.
I can't say it. I don't think I've ever sworn that badly online ever before. I can beep it. So it was this wonderful chap. I really liked him at Prime Media called Alan Watson. And we were working with a retailer in South Africa and he'd introduced us. And this was Pick and Pay, which was then very successful. He's not there now, so I'm okay. And he said, I want you to meet this guy and tell him all about loyalty. So I did my whole spiel of, we do all of this for Tesco and it's all about generating you being loyal to the customer. And what this creates is a really special relationship. And in the end, the customer feels that they want to come back. They want to visit one more time. They want to put one more item in their basket. And we can create the mechanics that would allow you to do that in your business. And at the end of it, he leant forward. He said, let me tell you, he said, if I want effing loyalty, I'll get myself an effing dog. And I just sat there and thought, oh my God, some of these guys were tough. really tough. And I was growing up really fast. So we had some really hard pushbacks at times.
And so how did the investor director help you there?
He just laughed with me and we just said, okay, bad news, let's go on to the next one. And I liked that. For me, retailers are some of the best business guys in the world. They work on the lowest margins. It's 24/7. They start their planning meetings at 7:30 on a Monday morning. I don't think most people know how hard retailers work. It's exhausting. It's every day, regardless. There are no gaps. You walk into retailers with the boss, and as they're walking around the store, they're noticing all the things that are wrong, and they're picking up products, and the manager's behind them, and they're saying, get rid of that, move that, that looks wrong. What do you think about that? And it's 100% of the time. I still never learned to do that in a store the way they learn. But it was always, you could see they were totally fixated with how the store looked. And if customers spoke to them, they would stop and ask them what they thought. How many leaders of business do you see doing that today on the shop floor?
Not enough. So that's interesting. That sounds like you got the introductions you talked about there and also the support to keep that your head up at times when you had some downs. That was where those investor directors added value. In the 2000s, you began the international expansion. What was the board's input there?
Zero.
And so how did you make that work?
So we realized, so when we started work with Tesco, we were working for Amazon. And when Tesco said that they were going to compete hard against Amazon, Amazon fired us, which was sad, especially when you look at Amazon today. But we'd made our bed and it was the Tesco bed and that was our commitment.
Do you regret that?
No, absolutely not. I don't regret anything.
How did you evaluate that decision of which horse to back? What were the pros, cons?
We were already committed to Tesco.
So you didn't have a choice?
No.
With their ownership in you?
No, but we wouldn't have. I'm a great believer in that very old saying, a bird in the hand. You always have to go. Whoever's shown you that trust already, you stick with. You never trade them in for someone that looks shinier and newer. It's a very easy trap, I think, to fall into. Having said that, though, we did realise that I think at this stage, Tesco was taking 1 in every 8 pounds from consumers in the UK. So it was absolutely hugely dominant. And we realised that no one else in the UK was going to work with us. So it was at that time we said, we need to be able to work internationally and we need to be able to work with your competition, Tesco. Is that okay? And again, to their absolute credit, they said I think it was 2 or 3 names that they said they didn't want us to work for. And they said, other than that, you can work for anybody. So it was at that point we did our plan and we worked out what we called our land grab, which was we'd worked out that because we wanted to support the consumer products companies, we had to be in the 12 predominant markets for those CPGs. So we identified which markets and which retailers were the top 3 in every one of those 12 markets. And we said, that's our plan, that's our strategy. And then we would go to each country and we would meet all 3 of those retailers and say, doing this for Tesco, we've doubled their market share in less than 3 years. We can do the same for you. We have this customer science, this customer first strategy. We can only work with 1 player in each country. Would you like it to be you? And we would go to the biggest, then the next. And the first one that said yes.
That's a great pitch to have. It's so interesting because that runs against all my own personal experience as an investor. When you go into foreign countries, your chances of winning if you haven't got a partner on the ground have always been historically very low. But I guess, were you able to leverage some of Tesco's relationships out there, or what enabled you to succeed? It was just the strength of the product and the offering.
We were the only people doing what we were doing, and they were all watching Tesco win against really strong competition. I mean, at the time, Sainsbury's had been number one by quite a big margin in the UK. And when we launched Tesco Clubcard, Tesco matched them and then doubled their market share in a very short space of time. So all the retailers had been watching this all over the world. And so when we arrived in each country, all they said to us was, we want to do a Tesco. That was all they said. We want to do a Tesco.
Did you ever get bitten by any of those 12 markets, or did they all work out equally well?
No, some didn't work quite so well because the market was a bit small and the retailer wasn't very dominant. And it worked best when the retailer was really strong. To be honest, America worked brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly, because Kroger, which no one's ever heard of, it's second only to Walmart. They had 3,500 stores when we started working with them. So far more than Tesco.
So presumably Walmart had said no to you. You'd gone to them first and they'd said no thanks? Or that was one of the lists that you weren't allowed to go to?
Very clever.
I'm delighted to announce Enter the Boardroom now has its first sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform saving you time and money on your cross-border transactions. As an investor, I was acutely aware of the value of hedging FX exposure. I used to live in fear of funding shortfalls at a closing or making a loss in a business having forecast a profit. However, as a CEO, I'm embarrassed to say I have dropped the ball on FX. Because we invoice our revenue in pound sterling, I stupidly thought we had minimal FX exposure. After speaking with Alt21, I realized a significant proportion of our software costs are in US dollars. So we have wasted money on FX fees and widespread, while also taking on unnecessary risk in our budgeting because we assumed the spot rate would continue through the year. I can't be the only one to have slipped up on this, and it's an area board members can quickly add value with the right questions. Alt21 allows you to lock in fixed fees and secure exchange rate before any cross-border transaction, allowing you to budget with certainty and protect your business from market volatility. At NewRoll, we're now forecasting savings of 90% on the fees we incur on the tens of thousands of monthly FX spend thanks to Alt21. Head to alt21.com, that's ALT21.com to find out more. You started working with various strategic partnerships. Can you talk me through some of the thinking that went into those and how you got comfortable? Because you partnered with some fairly big players. And as a small or medium-sized business, the scary thing about partnering with big players like that is always that they just take your IP and do it themselves once they've figured out what your magic sauce is. What was your approach?
Do you mean you still mean the retailers as partners to you?
I think you had various strategic partners. It wasn't only the retailers, right? I think you mentioned SAS was one of them.
Yeah. With the retailers, we were 50-50. And even though for us that 50% was multi-millions, for the retailers, it was almost small change because they're so big. That Clive always used to remind me that our business was about the equivalent in revenue as a supermarket car park. So the investment in us was about the equivalent. So we were tiny, even though we were so excited and we were growing phenomenally fast and were very profitable. Our ability to deliver billions of pounds more to their bottom line was far more important than how much we earned from the joint venture. Thank goodness.
Was that a deliberate pricing strategy? Because I guess that is one strategy to say, we're going to price this so cheaply that it's not worth their while to copy us. Or it could have been that actually, did you underprice it? If you were adding so much value to their operations and you were charging so little, could you have charged more?
You could argue that we definitely charged too little for what we were doing. But for us, we were thrilled. We grew $1 billion business. We sold it. It was worth far more than $1 billion. So yeah, it was underpriced, but we were happy.
Did you have those discussions around pricing with the sort of Tesco board at the time?
I think, to be honest, they were incredibly surprised when we managed to sell a similar deal in each of 12 countries. So they couldn't believe the revenue we achieved and the success we achieved. They said to us, we don't think it will work in America. So I just thought quietly, watch me. And we did.
What do you think they got wrong? What was the assumption they had made that they had misjudged?
I think they misjudged the importance of the data and that it wasn't just the brilliant execution of Tesco, because Tesco did execute extremely well. And they are an amazing business and an amazing leadership. But the data and the science we introduced worked everywhere. And that was the bit that actually people found hard to believe. It was entirely replicated.
And you said you operated with a same 50-50 model everywhere. Was that 50-50 ownership?
Yes.
Interesting. So everywhere you went, you had a 50-50 ownership, which meant that the interests of your customer were aligned with you.
Exactly. And they never let us fail. So going into America is really hard, but when you have a retailer who won't let you fail, it's amazing. And they helped us every step of the way. They helped us find officers. They helped us recruit some of the best people. They helped get us a bank when we couldn't get credit for our employees who were moving out there to lead the relationship. So yeah, the retailers really were fantastic partners and friends, making sure that we succeeded in the end.
It's a fascinating anti-pattern because, again, like in all my experience, having customers on your board is a disaster because they can see both sides of the negotiation table. Yeah. But I guess what you unlocked was you were so relatively insignificant and adding so much value. They didn't need to waste time on trying to win more through the insights that they were getting at the board level. Actually, it was just better to them to get on with it and help you succeed. And in a way, it sounds like they played a lot of the value add role you typically expect a board to have with those introductions, that support, the guidance on how to approach the market. You were getting a lot of that from them.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, at the end of the day, the revenue we received from the suppliers was far greater than the revenue we received from the retailers. So actually, when we repurposed the customer data and created an analytical kind of platform and profiles of customers that we sold to the CPGs, that was probably about 80% of our revenue. And all of those were global. So once we had 12 markets, we effectively had relationships with the biggest suppliers in the world.
Because you'd negotiated with each of them to own their data as well. So suddenly you became this data treasure trove. Yes. That any supplier wanting to get into one of those markets needed.
Exactly. So the 12 markets represented the majority of their sales globally. So we were able to give them the same kind of information for India as we could for Canada, as we could for Brazil.
Did you always have that strategy in mind that you'd sell the first bit, in a sense, quote unquote, cheap in order to unlock the value at the back end? Or was that something that emerged over time?
No, I don't think I was fully conscious. Retailers are really hard negotiators. It's very hard to get anything past any retailer. They are so savvy and they negotiate for a living. But certainly for the CPGs to have rich customer data of a similar style and format in every country around the world was a massive step change. And that was worth billions to them. So that's how it worked out. Yeah.
Reminds me of we used to have an investment into a business that sold into the retailers, and some of the stories they used to tell us of the negotiators being cycled round, I think every sort of 3 months so that they couldn't build any relationship with them, and then having shoes thrown at them when they issued offers that they didn't like. Hopefully you never had a shoe thrown at you.
I think sometimes it's an advantage being a woman.
You've since sat on a number of boards and seen the role boards can play. With benefit of hindsight, do you think if you'd had a board, it would have been able to add more value for you on that journey?
I think the shape of boards today is very different to how I would have thought of it back then. I had an incredible management team, really incredible with really fantastic skills. And we did have along the way a couple of independent directors. And we had the wonderful Professor Don Schultz, who was the head of integrated marketing from Northwestern University. And he was such a great person to have on your team. He was just amazing. He understood what we were doing, and very few people did at the beginning. Intellectually, he was really astute, and he was so excited that we were enacting this strategy and this theory, that he could see it playing out, and he would offer up ideas and challenges of what we could test and how we could approach it. So he was just great. And the team, the management team we had they were all very different and all very creative. So I don't think we lacked stimulation. Our main problem was, how do you take a company that's only 8 years old and support multi-billion pound, dollar, euro companies in 12 countries? All at the same time. Where do you get those people from when you've literally just created a new industry? And so we had to create an academy within the company and train people. And it was like a production line. We were literally training the brightest minds on how to do what we did. And when we'd win a new retailer in a different country, we would always send 2 people to lead the initiative. And I knew every time that we sent these 2 people off, I'd get a phone call from the CEO. And he was always a he, would say to me, "Why have you sent me children?" And I would always say the same thing, which is, I can send you people who are older, but I can't send you people who know as much as these guys, because they've learnt it inside out for the last 8 years. And that's what you've got.
That's so interesting. I see a very small parallel there with what we have. We have within our team, we have sector experts who help boards with drafting the role briefs and selecting the right candidates to interview. And we'll sometimes get that feedback, like, you've got kids running these things. And what I have to say to them is, look, these kids, quote unquote, have done more board placements than someone who's been in the industry for 50, 60 years. A single one of them might have done 1,000 board placements. They are the world expert in this space. And yet people find it very difficult to disconnect that age and experience connection, which is really interesting to see that parallel. You talked about your marketing professor and the expert. What was the single most valuable contribution he made? Can you give me a sort of practical example that someone listening to this, who's perhaps from a marketing background, can get a feel for how they might be able to add value in a board with that sort of background?
He came with a very specific talent. So he came understanding marketing, but being highly numerative. So that's an unusual combination. And he and Clive, who was our head science person, had a really special relationship, because they'd bounce off each other and they'd think about, why are you doing it that way? Have you looked at it the other way? And they would have those really creative conversations. And actually, one of the things that this Don Schultz, who's the guy I'm talking about, would say is, I'll give you a very concrete example. We would have very clear ideas for consumer segments, and we would see from the data what those consumers were buying, and we would be able to tell that as a story. So these people, for example, are can't cook, won't cook. And so what do you do with that? We were trying to brief agencies on this, but because they'd been used to much sort of clunkier segmentation, they weren't quite getting the subtleties of, well, what does that look like? How do you speak to someone who doesn't like cooking, but you don't want to shove it in their face? You want to say it really politely, which is, you're too busy. And actually what you want is speed and ease and healthy, but fast. And he said, why aren't you creating your own agency to show what that creative would look like? And that's what we did. We created our own agency, and we actually started to develop creative, which really aligned with the data stories and the segmentation, so that we were able to show that if you speak in the right language to people, they respond better. Now, it all seems very obvious. Now, you're thinking AI, data, that's how it works. It didn't back then. That kind of creative development, that kind of creative concept came out of the fact that until we could show that the way you say something and the pictures that you show all create a better response from the customer, until we could align those two, it wasn't happening. And so you could tell the story and then they'd all get the same offer. And it would be like, what's the point?
Can we talk briefly about the exit? You exited to Tesco in stages, I think, and there were multiple stages at each time. Again, that's always, I think, one of the things that terrifies a lot of founders I meet is that exit and being held into some sort of earn-out where they've lost control and they lose motivation quickly and they see the value that they've built being destroyed. What was your approach there, and what did you learn with the benefit of hindsight around the way you approached that?
I think we were lucky in the sense that at no stage did Tesco take over running the business. They were far too busy. We were a car park, remember? So literally, it wasn't worth anyone telling us what to do. And there were some lovely quotes from within Tesco, which is, I've been working with you for the last 10 years. I still don't know how you do what you do, but it seems to work. So one very good angle is to not be completely crystal clear about how you do what you do. I don't think that was ever our intention, but it ended up being the result. So they left us alone, which was fantastic. When Tesco bought in to the 53%, we at that time agreed what the final sell formula would be. We agreed an absolute formula and wrote it into a contract that when we eventually sold, or as we sold down, that would be the formula for the value we received. And so when we stayed, we sold down parts of our equity over time. And in the end, Tesco actually allowed us to keep a bit more equity for later on because we were going gangbusters later on and everything was up. And so we wanted to keep in as much equity as we could until the end. And when the end finally came, we beat our target, which was like, whoa, this is fantastic. And we had the formula. And there was no argument. There was no discussion. We just got handed a check and it was sweet. And we have no regrets. And they gave us no grief at all.
Gosh, another amazing anti-pattern. There's so few founders I actually do would describe their new investors as sweet. When you talk about a formula, was that a multiple against profit or earnings, an agreed line that effectively you had in place and then you just had to control for the revenues or the profit or whatever it was?
Absolutely. I obviously can't be specific, but yeah, it was crystal clear. And I have to thank our wonderful lawyers and advisors for helping us do that, because you're right. It isn't everybody's idea of a great deal at the end of the day. And a lot of people love asking you, don't you think you sold out cheap? And didn't you regret that you didn't hold out for longer? We've never had a single regret. We had a great run. We were treated really well and we got what we thought we were going to get. We were happy.
Edwina, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round where I say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Oh, crikey, I'm going to look at my notes for this because they were complicated. Okay, go for it.
Best book every board member should read and why?
I don't love management handbooks. I think the best thing to do is read a newspaper, know what's going on right now in the world.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
Silence. That look that is, don't know, I don't agree, I'm not saying anything. Silence.
Most valuable board ritual?
Making sure everybody speaks.
Favourite quote?
My favourite quote is from a chap called Red Adair, who you probably won't know of. He was an oil firefighter, and I loved it when he said, if you think experts are expensive, try amateurs.
Most significant professional insight?
I think learn from what's happened, but don't lose any energy on looking back, move forwards. Focus all your energy on the next step.
The worst professional advice you've ever received.
You won't win in America.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I love a management team kind of board, and governance to me is exhausting and frustrating.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
That sometimes I'm far too impatient and I should learn to listen more and longer.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I think I'm very aware of the role I'm being asked to play now. It takes time to understand what a chair does and what an NED does versus an executive, but you have to get that right.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Okay, this really made me think, this one. I had 3. Okay, hold your faith in what you believe. It's your most precious asset. Make sure you have really intelligent and allies that will stand up to you, that can disagree and will tell you how and why. Really important. And then thirdly, probably the most important of all, is be decisive.
Edwina, I love speaking to successful founders. That has been such a treat. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and wisdom.
It's a joy, Oliver. You are a real pleasure to speak to.
Building a non-exec career is hard. For those starting out, boards can be opaque. For more experienced board members, it can be lonely and hard to stay match fit. Having placed almost 4,000 people on boards in the last 5 years, we know what success looks like. It requires time, energy, resilience, information, and connections. New Role Plus, our community of board peers, exists to give you these things, offering you wholesale support as you try to get board roles and become a standout Ned. Find out more at newrole.com/newrole-plus. That's newrole.com/newrole-plus.